can I just say thank you very much for all your kindness to me, all of you, during my period of office. I wish my successor all good fortune and Godspeed to you all.
Thank you very much.
Solemnly promise and swear to govern the peoples of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Pakistan.
At the Queen's coronation in 1953, Britain still ruled one of the largest empires the world has ever known.
According to their respective laws and customs.
I solemnly promise so to do.
But within 20 years it had ceased to exist and had been replaced by some 40 independent states. It was one of the greatest abdications of power in the history of the world.
The writing was on the wall for the British Empire after 1945. The country was virtually bankrupt, and the idea of defending a far-flung empire seemed virtually impossible. Britain had difficulties enough saving herself from bankruptcy, never mind defending the empire. And in 1947, when India had to be let go, it seemed that the rest of the empire must surely follow. Britain did try to beat an orderly retreat from Asia and Africa, but now the jewel in the crown was really gone. Moreover, the idea of empire seemed obsolete and out of date. This was the world of the United Nations and of the new superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. In this world, the British Empire was bound to collapse. Britain was to seek through the Commonwealth a bridge between the old empire and the new post-war world.
The rock and roll king was about to embark for foreign service, 18 months in Germany.
Elvis, since you've been in the Army, have the boys given you kind of a rough time in the barracks because of your past career, would you say?
No, sir, I was very surprised. I've never met a better group of boys in my life.
What it meant to be an imperial power was brought home to the British when citizens of the empire took up their right to live and work in Britain.
In Trinidad, where I was born, the British missions used to show films of white people welcoming black people to Britain. It was after the war when the cry was to come and help rebuild the mother country. The saying was that the streets of London were paved with gold. Most people came with the idea of staying for 5 years, getting the gold that they wanted, and going back to their countries of birth. Some of them are still here. They have not returned.
125,000 people arrived from the West Indies between 1948 and 1958. After the initial shock of the cold, grey climate, many faced prejudice from a white population that had once been more tolerant. Disappointment and disillusionment were the everyday experience of the 1950s settler.
Asked a woman for a lodging, she looked me in the eye, pointed to a little notice, no colours need apply.
Housing was a major problem. In the housing, we saw notices which read, rooms and flats to let, no children, no Irish, no dogs, no coloreds. And when we telephoned and made arrangements to go, you would find the landlady or the landlord would say, yes, come, we've got a room. You got there and they saw a black face, and if you didn't leave when they indicated that your presence was no longer required or tolerated, they would either throw water at you, they would spit at you, or they would call the police. And so therefore, we had to leave. We had to leave. It was a terrible disappointment because it conflicted totally with the imagery of white people welcoming black people into their homes. That was a sad disappointment for us.
The great majority of the West Indian settlers were in their 20s, and they had plenty to offer Britain. Many were skilled manual workers, and their first disappointment was having to accept lower status jobs than they'd had before.
Employment was another major problem. At their labor exchanges, vacancy cards for companies that refused to employ black people were stamped NCP, which did not mean National Car Park, but meant no colored person. The skills that we had, it was impossible to get jobs along those lines. There were people who were better qualified, older people who were better qualified than I was. They came, they were professionals in their own countries. They took jobs sweeping the street, sweeping the railway stations, working as hospital porters, and so on. It was a real demeaning experience.
Clarence Thompson was a skilled technician in an oil refinery before coming to Britain, but found it impossible to get skilled work here. He became a labourer on a building site.
You couldn't get promotion. You had to stay where you are. You were worse paid than anybody else. You know, and everyone called you names, and you had to tolerate it. If you reacted when people called you a name, you were described as having a chip on your shoulder, and people were totally insulting. But we had no right to actually say, well, you know, that's not fair. That's not right. You shouldn't do things like that. We couldn't say that to people. We had to be very tolerant.
Many of the immigrants were shocked at the level of racism they encountered.
They're a nuisance when you've got to walk past them in the streets. They won't move. They're a nuisance at work. They won't work. And for folks who got them living by them, they're a nuisance, more nuisance still.
When you went into a pub, the bartender wouldn't serve you. And if you had made friends with a white person who then took you into the pub and ordered a drink, the bartender, having seen you use the glass, would then break the glass rather than wash it.
In the city's dance halls, nobody is barred, but colored men are not encouraged.
Going out with a white woman, the white woman was always designated as a prostitute, because the saying at the time was that no decent white woman would ever go out with a black man. I felt pretty bitter. I felt totally betrayed by the principles that we saw, because out in the Caribbean we regarded Britain as the mother country. And what do you think the word mother means? It's someone who cares for you, understands, hears your cries and your pains and your anxieties, and is there to help you along. That is how the kind of imagery that we had of Britain, and only to find then that they didn't want black people around. There was total contempt for black people.
The people of Cuba celebrated the collapse of the Batista dictatorship. 7 days later, they were cheering the triumphal entry into Havana, the capital of Dr. Fidel Castro.
In most categories, Britain is well ahead of competition. The Triumph Herald, with everything easy to get at, will do close on 50 miles to the gallon at cruising speeds. New this year at the Motor Show is the Morris Mini Minor. Its engine across the frame, a novel, appealing feature.
It's easy to spot the changes, the novelties of the 1950s. Old attitudes shaken by the new prosperity, the teenage revolution, the weaknesses of the economy and the decline of the empire. Yet this was a deeply conservative decade. For most of the British people, attitudes and values were still those of the pre-war years. It was the next decade, the 1960s, which marked the real watershed.